The emergency HOA meeting notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under doors like a death warrant. Emergency session called by Board President Karen Mitchell. It read in her sharp, angular handwriting. Subject immediate action required regarding property violations and resident non-compliance. My coffee grew cold as I read the fine print. The legalese that most residents would gloss over. But I recognized the weapon being wielded. After 15 years as legal counsel for the mayor's office, I knew a setup when I saw one. The target was obvious. 3 doors down from my own townhouse. Maria Santos still hung her husband's police dress blues in the front window, the fabric catching morning light like a flag of honor. Officer David Santos had been gunned down 6 months ago, responding to a domestic violence call, leaving behind a wife, 2 young children, and a community still reeling from the loss. The memorial wreaths had finally stopped arriving. But Maria's quiet dignity remained, along with her determination to keep their home despite the crushing weight of grief and financial uncertainty. I walked to my kitchen window and watched Maria's 8-year-old daughter, Sophia, practicing basketball on their driveway, her sneakers squeaking against the concrete with each determined dribble. The hoop David had installed last Christmas hung slightly askew now, but Sophia didn't seem to notice. Her younger brother Miguel sat on the front steps, meticulously arranging his toy cars in perfect lines. The same focused expression his father had worn when reviewing case files at neighborhood barbecues. Karen Mitchell's pristine white BMW pulled into her driveway across the street, the engine purring with expensive efficiency. She emerged in her usual armor of pressed slacks and silk blouses, her blonde hair sprayed into submission despite the autumn breeze. At 52, Karen had turned homeowners association politics into her personal kingdom, wielding bylaws like scepters and fines like royal edicts. She paused to photograph Sophia's basketball practice with her phone, and I felt my jaw clench. Evidence gathering. The Santos family had been living in Willowbrook Heights for 3 years, ever since David's promotion to detective had finally made homeownership possible. They'd painted their front door a cheerful blue, planted marigolds in window boxes, and hosted block parties that actually brought neighbors together instead of driving them apart. Maria worked as a bilingual teacher at the elementary school, her gentle manner masking the steel spine that had carried her through police wives' meetings and late-night vigils. She deserved better than Karen Mitchell's particular brand of suburban tyranny. My phone buzzed with a text from my neighbor, elderly Mrs. Chen, who lived next to the Santos family. "Did you see that woman taking pictures again? This feels wrong. Jennifer, very wrong." Mrs. Chen had escaped political persecution in Taiwan decades ago. She recognized the signs of systematic targeting better than most. Her instincts were rarely off. I pulled up the HOA covenant documents on my laptop, scrolling through the dense legal language that governed our supposedly harmonious community. Every rule was there, from lawn height requirements to acceptable window decoration protocols. But I also knew what wasn't written down: the selective enforcement patterns. The way certain families received multiple violation notices, while others' infractions went unnoticed. The gradual erosion of community spirit under Karen's increasingly authoritarian leadership. The front door slammed across the street, and Karen emerged again, this time carrying a manila folder thick with documents. She marched directly to Maria's house, her heels clicking against the sidewalk like a countdown timer. I moved to my front porch, pretending to water plants while straining to hear their conversation. "Mrs. Santos, I need to discuss several urgent matters with you." Karen's voice carried the false sweetness of artificial sugar, cloying and ultimately bitter. "May I come in?" Maria appeared in her doorway, Sophia's basketball tucked under her arm, confusion evident in her dark eyes. "Of course, Mrs. Mitchell. Is everything all right?" "That depends entirely on your willingness to cooperate with community standards." Karen brushed past Maria into the house, without waiting for a proper invitation. Her folder clutched like evidence in a criminal trial. 20 minutes later, Karen emerged alone, her expression triumphant. Maria remained in her doorway, long after Karen's BMW disappeared, her shoulders sagging under some invisible weight. The basketball lay forgotten on the front lawn, and even from across the street, I could see the papers trembling in Maria's hands. I walked over, my legal training warring with my human instincts. Professional distance versus moral obligation. The choice was easier than it should have been. "Maria, everything okay?" She looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but defiant. "She's trying to kick us out." The words came out flat, matter of fact, as if she were reading a grocery list instead of describing the potential destruction of her family's stability. Violation notices for David's memorial wreath being up too long, for Sophia's basketball hoop not meeting aesthetic standards, for Miguel's chalk drawings on the driveway. Her voice cracked slightly. "She says we're negatively impacting property values, and that the board has grounds for forced sale under the covenant's Community Harmony Clause." The Community Harmony Clause. I'd helped draft similar language for other municipalities, never imagining it would be weaponized against a grieving family. The irony was suffocating. "Maria, I need you to know something. I work for the city attorney's office. I specialize in housing law and municipal governance." I kept my voice steady, professional. "This smells like selective enforcement and possibly discriminatory practice. Would you like me to take a look at those documents?" Relief flooded her features, followed quickly by wariness. Trust didn't come easily anymore. Not after months of bureaucratic battles with insurance companies and pension administrators. "Why would you help us? You barely know us." "Because what's happening here isn't right. And because your husband died protecting this community. That should mean something." She handed me the violation notices, her fingers lingering on mine for just a moment. "He always said there were good people everywhere, even in the worst situations." I'm starting to think he was right. That evening, I spread Maria's documents across my dining room table like puzzle pieces, each violation notice a carefully crafted instrument of harassment. Karen had been thorough, 37 separate infractions dating back 4 months, each carrying escalating fines and increasingly urgent language about board action. But she'd also been sloppy, her personal animosity bleeding through the professional veneer. The memorial wreath violation was dated 3 days after David's funeral, when the flowers were still fresh and the community was still processing their grief. The basketball hoop notice had been filed on Sophia's birthday. The same day, Maria had posted photos of their small celebration on social media. Every violation seemed timed for maximum emotional impact, a pattern of cruelty disguised as administrative necessity. My laptop hummed as I cross-referenced Karen's enforcement actions with public records. The picture that emerged was damning selective targeting of minority families, particularly those with children or elderly residents. Mrs. Chen's garden gnomes had never received a violation notice, despite violating the same aesthetic standards that condemned Sophia's basketball hoop. The McCormick family's boat trailer had been parked in their driveway for 2 years without consequence, while Maria received citations for leaving her minivan on the street during Sophia's piano lessons. But the most revealing document was buried in the board meeting minutes from 18 months ago, when David was still alive and active in community affairs. He'd questioned Karen's decision to hire her brother-in-law's security company without competitive bidding, suggesting the process be opened to other vendors. The motion had died without a second, but Karen's response was recorded in unusual detail. Some residents seemed to forget that community leadership requires respect for established authority. Perhaps Officer Santos would benefit from focusing on his day job rather than interfering with board governance. The pattern clicked into place. This wasn't about community standards or property values. This was revenge, served cold and calculated, targeting a man who dared to question Karen's authority and continuing against his family after his death. It was systematic, methodical, and completely illegal under both state housing discrimination laws and federal civil rights statutes. My phone rang, pulling me from the documents. Mayor Williams' voice was tired but concerned. "Jennifer, I've been getting calls about some HOA situation in your neighborhood. Something about harassment of a police widow." "It's worse than harassment, Tom. It's organized retaliation with racist undertones, using HOA bylaws as weapons. The family is looking at forced sale unless something changes." "Can you handle it through official channels? Or do we need to get more creative?" "Let me try the direct approach first. Sometimes the threat of real legal consequences is enough to restore sanity." "Keep me posted." And Jennifer, Officer Santos was a good man. His family deserves better than this. The next morning brought developments I hadn't anticipated. Mrs. Chen called at 6:30, her voice shaking with anger. They towed Maria's car. In the middle of the night, said it was parked illegally, but she was in her own driveway. I threw on clothes and rushed outside to find Maria standing where her minivan should have been, clutching a bright orange towing notice. Sophia and Miguel watched from the front window, their faces pressed against the glass like prisoners. "They can't do this," Maria said, her voice hollow with exhaustion. "The car payment is up to date. Insurance is current. Registration is valid. It was in my own driveway." I read the towing notice, recognizing the company name from the board meeting minutes. Karen's brother-in-law's operation. Naturally. The authorization cites overnight parking violations, but there's no timestamp on this notice. "When did you park there?" "Yesterday afternoon, after grocery shopping. Same place I always park." She gestured helplessly at the empty space. "I don't understand how this is legal." "It's not." I pulled out my phone and dialed the towing company, switching to my official voice. "This is Jennifer Martinez from the Mayor's Office Legal Department. I need the immediate return of a vehicle improperly towed from private property at 1247 Willowbrook Lane. License plate number." Maria provided the information, and I continued. "The vehicle must be returned within 2 hours, or the city will pursue charges for theft of personal property and violations of municipal towing ordinances." The dispatcher's attitude shifted from bureaucratic indifference to nervous cooperation within seconds. "Yes, ma'am. I'll have it back immediately. No charge for the return." Maria stared at me as I hung up. "You can do that?" "When someone commits a crime in broad daylight. Yes. But this escalation tells me Karen's getting desperate. Emergency board meetings, illegal towing, harassment of children. She's losing control and making mistakes." The minivan returned 90 minutes later, delivered by a sheepish driver who refused to make eye contact. But Karen's BMW appeared moments after the tow truck left, parking directly across from Maria's driveway in a position that provided clear surveillance of the Santos family's activities. The message was unmistakable. "I'm watching. I'm in control. I can reach you anywhere." That afternoon, I visited the county courthouse to research property records and HOA governance documents. What I found in the filing cabinets painted a picture of systematic financial manipulation that made the harassment campaign look like a warm-up act. Karen had been using her board position to funnel community funds through her family's businesses, landscaping contracts to her husband's company at above-market rates, insurance policies through her cousin's agency despite cheaper alternatives, and maintenance agreements with her brother-in-law's operations that included services the community didn't need. But the smoking gun was in the special assessment records. 3 years ago, Karen had pushed through a costly infrastructure improvement project that added $50,000 to every homeowner's annual fees. The work had been contracted exclusively to Mitchell Family Enterprises. With no competitive bidding and minimal board oversight, David Santos had been one of only 2 residents to request financial documentation, and both men had received their first HOA violation notices within a week of filing their requests. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening in the community center, a sterile conference room decorated with motivational posters about teamwork and community spirit. I arrived 30 minutes early, parking where I could observe the other attendees without being immediately noticed. Maria walked in, looking tired but determined, carrying a folder of her own documents. Several other residents trickled in. Mrs. Chen, with her careful English and fierce loyalty. The Johnsons from the end of the block. And surprisingly, Detective Ray Morrison from David's old precinct. Karen made her entrance precisely at 7 o'clock, flanked by the other board members who had been notably absent from neighborhood gatherings since her rise to power. She carried herself like a prosecutor approaching a guilty verdict, her expression mixing satisfaction with barely concealed contempt. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending this emergency session. Karen's voice echoed in the small room, artificially amplified by her sense of authority. We're here to address serious violations of community standards that threaten property values and neighborhood harmony. Mrs. Santos, please take a seat in the front row. Maria complied, her back straight despite the circumstances. Sophia and Miguel weren't present. Detective Morrison had arranged for them to stay with his family for the evening, understanding that children shouldn't witness their mother's public humiliation. The board has conducted a thorough review of property compliance in our community, Karen continued, reading from prepared remarks. Unfortunately, we've identified a pattern of willful violations at 1247 Willowbrook Lane that have persisted despite multiple notices and opportunities for correction. She enumerated each violation with prosecutorial precision, the memorial wreath that remained beyond reasonable mourning periods, the basketball hoop that created noise disturbances and safety hazards, the chalk drawings that constituted defacement of common areas, and most damaging, the financial obligations that were allegedly in arrears due to accumulated fine payments. The total amount owed is $8,437, Karen announced, her voice carrying the finality of a gavel. If not paid within 30 days, the board will exercise its authority under Section 15.3 of the Community Covenant to initiate forced sale proceedings. The room fell silent. Mrs. Chen's sharp intake of breath was audible, and Detective Morrison's jaw tightened visibly. But Maria remained composed, her hands folded in her lap like she was attending a church service rather than her own execution. Mrs. Santos, do you have anything to say in response to these findings? Maria stood slowly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. My husband died protecting this community. He took a bullet meant for a woman he'd never met, because that's what good people do. And now you want to throw his children out of their home because I hung his badge in our window. She paused, gathering strength. David always said justice wasn't about power. It was about doing what's right when no one's watching. I guess he was wrong about the watching part. Mrs. Santos, emotional appeals don't supersede legal obligations, Karen replied, her tone suggesting Maria's grief was merely an inconvenience. The board's decision is final unless you can provide immediate payment or demonstrate compliance with all community standards. That's when I stood up. Actually, Mrs. Mitchell, the board's authority is considerably more limited than you've represented. I moved to the front of the room, pulling documents from my briefcase with deliberate ceremony. Jennifer Martinez, Chief Legal Counsel for the Mayor's Office. I've been reviewing your governance practices, and I'm afraid there are significant irregularities that need to be addressed. Karen's face went through several color changes, settling on an unbecoming shade of red. This is a private homeowners association matter. The city has no jurisdiction here. Actually, when HOA actions violate federal civil rights statutes, state housing discrimination laws, and municipal corruption ordinances, jurisdiction becomes very clear. I placed my first exhibit on the table. Let's start with selective enforcement. Mrs. Santos has received 37 violation notices in 4 months, while identical conditions at other properties have gone unaddressed for years. I methodically laid out the evidence photographs of Mrs. Chen's garden gnomes, alongside the citation Maria received for decorative items. Documentation of the McCormick boat trailer versus Sophia's basketball hoop violations. Time-stamped records showing the coordinated timing of citations with family milestones and grief markers. This pattern constitutes harassment based on racial and ethnic discrimination, which violates the Fair Housing Act and exposes both individual board members and the association to federal civil rights litigation. Karen attempted to interrupt, but I continued without pause. More concerning are the financial irregularities. 3 years of board contracts awarded exclusively to Mitchell family businesses without competitive bidding, representing approximately $200,000 in community funds. The special assessment that funded your husband's company was approved by a board vote that occurred without proper notice to residents, violating both state sunshine laws and the association's own bylaws. I produced the courthouse documents, the meeting minutes, the bank records I'd subpoenaed that afternoon through emergency municipal authority. Mrs. Mitchell, you've been operating a criminal enterprise disguised as community governance. The pattern of financial self-dealing, combined with the systematic harassment of families who questioned your authority, constitutes racketeering under federal RICO statutes. The other board members were studying their shoes, clearly unaware of the scope of Karen's operations. Detective Morrison was taking notes, his police instincts engaged despite his off-duty status. Mrs. Chen was smiling for the first time in months. Furthermore, I continued, placing the illegal towing documentation on the table. Last night's vehicle theft, orchestrated through your family's towing company, constitutes criminal conspiracy and abuse of process. The district attorney will be receiving a complete investigative package tomorrow morning. Karen finally found her voice. You can't prove any of this. These are baseless accusations from someone who obviously has a personal agenda. Actually, I can prove all of it. Bank records, email communications, board meeting recordings that you weren't aware were being made. I gestured to Mrs. Chen, who produced a small digital recorder from her purse. Mrs. Chen has been documenting board meetings for her English language practice. Very thorough records. The room was completely silent now, the weight of accumulated evidence crushing Karen's carefully constructed authority. But I wasn't finished. Here's what's going to happen. Mrs. Santos's violation notices are hereby declared null and void due to discriminatory enforcement and procedural irregularities. All fines are forgiven, and the family's good standing in the community is restored immediately. I move to the next document. The board will vote tonight to remove Mrs. Mitchell from all positions of authority and ban her from future governance roles. The association will undergo a complete financial audit by an independent firm, with results published to all residents. And finally, I place the last document on the table. The city is initiating a comprehensive investigation into HOA governance practices citywide. Mrs. Mitchell's operation will serve as a case study in how community authority can be perverted into personal enrichment and targeted harassment. Karen stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor like fingernails on a chalkboard. "This is all highly irregular. I'll be contacting my attorney immediately." "Please do. I'm sure he'll be fascinated by the evidence we've compiled." I handed her a business card. "He can reach me at the city attorney's office to discuss your cooperation with the ongoing investigation." The vote to remove Karen from the board was unanimous among the remaining members, who seemed eager to distance themselves from her practices. She left without another word, her heels clicking rapidly toward the exit like a retreat signal. In the aftermath, as residents gathered around Maria to offer support and apologies, Detective Morrison approached me with professional curiosity. "How long have you been building this case?" "About 18 hours. But the evidence was all there, waiting for someone to connect the dots. Your partner was a good man who asked uncomfortable questions. He deserved better than this. He'd be proud of what you did tonight, and grateful his family has someone looking out for them." Mrs. Chen joined our conversation, her English precise and formal. "In my country, we saw what happens when small people get too much power over others. Thank you for stopping this before it went further." Maria was surrounded by neighbors who had been too intimidated to speak up before, all offering assistance and friendship that had been suppressed under Karen's regime. Sophia and Miguel would return tomorrow to a community that remembered how to care for its own. 3 weeks later, the full scope of Karen's financial schemes became public through the audit results. The association recovered nearly $300,000 in fraudulent contracts and excessive fees. Money that would go toward genuine community improvements instead of enriching the Mitchell family businesses. Karen and her husband faced federal charges for racketeering and conspiracy, with additional state charges for housing discrimination and municipal corruption. The basketball hoop was officially declared community recreation equipment and exempt from aesthetic standards. Sophia's chalk drawings were reclassified as temporary children's art displays with full board approval. David's memorial remained in the front window, joined by similar tributes from other residents honoring family members and community heroes. On a warm Saturday morning 6 months later, I found myself in Maria's backyard for Miguel's birthday party, watching as Detective Morrison's children played with Sophia and Miguel like they'd been friends forever. Mrs. Chen was teaching several neighbor children how to plant vegetables in her legendary garden, her patient instruction bridging language barriers through the universal language of growing things. Maria appeared beside me with 2 cups of coffee, her smile genuine for the first time since I'd known her. "You know, David always said communities were strongest when good people stood up for each other. I just never imagined how true that could be. He was right about good people being everywhere. Sometimes they just need someone to show them it's safe to stand up." Karen Mitchell's house had sold 2 months ago, the new owners already participating in community events with enthusiasm that reminded everyone what neighborhood spirit could look like. The HOA now operated with transparent financial reporting and rotating leadership, ensuring no single person could accumulate unchecked authority. As I watched Sophia teaching younger children her improved basketball techniques on the same hoop that had nearly cost her family their home, I reflected on the strange ways justice manifests itself. Sometimes it comes through grand gestures and legal victories. But more often, it arrives quietly through neighbors looking out for each other, communities remembering their shared humanity, and good people finding the courage to act when it matters most. The memorial wreath in Maria's window caught the afternoon sunlight, its blue ribbon fluttering gently in the breeze. Below it, Sophia's newest chalk drawing covered the driveway in explosions of color and hope, protected now by law and community consensus. Miguel had graduated from toy cars to a real bicycle, which he rode in careful circles around his sister's artwork, both children reclaiming the joy that had been systematically attacked but never destroyed. Detective Morrison approached me as the party began winding down, his own children reluctant to leave their new friends. The federal prosecutor called yesterday. Karen took a plea deal, 5 years minimum, plus full restitution and permanent ban from HOA governance anywhere in the state. Good. And her husband? 3 years. But he's cooperating fully with the investigation into other HOA corruption cases. Turns out this wasn't their first community. I nodded, unsurprised. Predators rarely limit themselves to single hunting grounds. How many other families were they targeting? 6 associations over 8 years. Always the same pattern: target minorities and elderly residents. Manufacture violations, force sales, acquire properties through shell companies, then flip them for profit. The FBI estimates they stole nearly $2 million in forced equity transfers. The scope was staggering, but the personal impact on individual families was incalculable. How many children had been forced from their homes? How many elderly residents had lost their life savings? How many communities had been poisoned by the systematic cruelty disguised as administrative necessity? At least it's over now, I said, watching Maria help Mrs. Chen pack leftover cake for the other children. For them. Yes. But there are copycat operations in suburbs all over the country. Small-scale corruption that flies under the radar until someone with legal resources decides to fight back. Morrison paused, considering. Most families don't have a neighbor who works for the mayor's office. That conversation stayed with me over the following weeks as I researched HOA governance issues nationally. The patterns were everywhere: selective enforcement targeting vulnerable residents, financial schemes disguised as administrative fees, and systematic intimidation of anyone who questioned board authority. Karen Mitchell wasn't an aberration. She was a symptom of a larger problem that infected communities nationwide. I began writing a comprehensive report for the mayor's office, documenting best practices for municipal oversight of homeowners associations, and recommending legislative changes to protect residents from predatory governance. The Santos family case became a template for identifying and prosecuting similar schemes, with Maria's documentation serving as evidence of how systematic harassment could be disguised as community standards enforcement. 6 months after Karen's sentencing, I received an unexpected invitation to speak at a national conference on housing rights and community governance. The invitation came from an organization representing police families, military spouses, and other groups often targeted by predatory HOA practices. They wanted me to share the Santos case as an example of successful resistance to systematic discrimination. Standing before an audience of advocates, attorneys, and affected families, I found myself thinking not about legal strategies or regulatory frameworks, but about Sophia's basketball bouncing against the garage door and Miguel's careful arrangement of toy cars in perfect lines. Justice, I realized, wasn't really about court victories or criminal convictions. It was about children feeling safe to play in their own driveways, neighbors caring for each other during difficult times, and communities remembering that their strength came from inclusion rather than exclusion. The Santos family had taught me something I'd forgotten during years of municipal law practice. Sometimes the most important legal work happens not in courtrooms or city council chambers, but in the quiet moments when good people decide to stand up for their neighbors. Sometimes justice arrives not through grand gestures, but through the simple act of refusing to let cruelty masquerade as authority. As I concluded my presentation, sharing the latest update from Willowbrook Heights, Sophia had made the school basketball team, Miguel was learning to read, and Maria had been elected to the HOA board with unanimous community support. I realized that Karen Mitchell's greatest failure wasn't her criminal behavior or financial schemes. Her greatest failure was her fundamental misunderstanding of what communities could be when they functioned properly, not kingdoms to be ruled, but families to be nurtured. Not assets to be exploited, but homes to be protected. Not hierarchies to be dominated, but networks of mutual support and shared humanity. The audience's applause faded, but the message remained clear. In suburbs and neighborhoods across the country, other families were facing their own Karen Mitchell's petty tyrants, who confused authority with power and compliance with community. But they were also surrounded by potential allies, who needed only the courage to act and the knowledge that resistance was possible. That evening, I called Maria to share how her story had resonated with advocates nationwide. Her voice was warm with satisfaction. David would be proud. He always said the best way to honor fallen officers was to protect the communities they died serving. I think we did that. We did more than that. We showed other communities how to protect themselves. As autumn returned to Willowbrook Heights, the neighborhood had transformed in ways both visible and subtle. Children played freely in common areas, without fear of violation notices. Elderly residents attended board meetings without intimidation. Families celebrated milestones openly, knowing their joy wouldn't be weaponized against them. The community had rediscovered its capacity for genuine care and mutual support. Sophia's basketball skills had improved dramatically, her confidence growing alongside her ability to sink free throws. Miguel had started a neighborhood car washing business, his attention to detail inherited from his father's investigative instincts. Maria had found her voice as a community leader, her gentle strength providing a stark contrast to Karen's authoritarian approach. Mrs. Chen's garden had become a gathering place for children and adults alike. Her patient teaching, creating bonds that transcended language and cultural barriers. Detective Morrison's family had moved into the neighborhood permanently, drawn by the authentic community spirit that had emerged from the ashes of Karen's regime. The memorial in Maria's window remained, but it was no longer a source of controversy or violation notices. Instead, it had become a symbol of the community's commitment to protecting its own, honoring sacrifice, and refusing to let grief be transformed into isolation. Other residents had added their own tributes, photographs of deceased family members, military service flags, symbols of personal and collective history that wove individual stories into a larger narrative of shared humanity. Standing in my own front yard on a crisp October evening, watching children from a dozen families play together in the fading light, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought us to this point. A year ago, Karen Mitchell had seemed untouchable, her authority absolute, her cruelty systematized and legally protected. The Santos family had appeared defenseless, isolated, and destined for displacement. But communities, like individuals, possess reserves of strength that become visible only under pressure. When Karen's campaign of harassment finally triggered collective resistance, the neighborhood's true character emerged, not the artificial harmony enforced through fear and compliance, but the genuine solidarity that develops when people choose to care for each other despite their differences. The legal victory had been satisfying, the criminal convictions appropriate, and the financial restitution necessary. But the real triumph was quieter and more profound: a community that had rediscovered its capacity for kindness, a family that had found safety in the support of neighbors, and children who could grow up understanding that home meant more than just a house. It meant belonging to something larger than themselves. As lights began appearing in windows across the neighborhood, each family settling into their evening routines, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from work well done and justice properly served. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Other communities would face their own predators, and the struggle for genuine equality and mutual care would continue in suburbs and neighborhoods across the country. But tonight, in Willowbrook Heights, children slept safely in their beds. Parents planned for futures that seemed secure, and elderly residents knew their community would protect them rather than exploit them. Tonight, justice wasn't an abstract concept. Debated in courtrooms, it was a living reality that manifested in neighbors looking out for each other, communities choosing inclusion over exclusion, and good people finding the courage to stand up when it mattered most. The memorial wreath in Maria's window caught the streetlight one last time as I turned toward my own home, its blue ribbon fluttering gently in the evening breeze. Below it, the faint outlines of Sophia's latest chalk artwork were still visible on the driveway, protected now not just by law, but by a community that had remembered how to value joy over conformity, humanity over authority, and love over fear. In the end, that transformation was Karen Mitchell's most important legacy, not the damage she had caused, but the strength she had inadvertently revealed in the community that chose to resist her particular brand of suburban tyranny and build something better in its place.